Good morning, everyone. I'm Steve Handelman. I'm the director of the Center on Media, Crime, and Justice at John Jay College, and we're pleased to welcome you to the second program in our webinar series on justice in the Southwest. We have a great lineup of speakers for you, and what I hope will be a really stimulating program. And of course, a program like this could not have happened and could not have gotten done without support and particularly the sponsorship of our partners at Arizona State University, the Sandra O'Connor College of Law, the Academy for Justice, whose founder and director, Professor Erik Luna, is here with us to say a few words of welcome. Erik?
Thank you, Stephen. Good to see everyone this morning. Wonderful to be here. Again, as Stephen said, I'm a law professor here at the Sandra O'Connor College of Law at ASU. I'm also the faculty director of the Academy for Justice, which is the law school's criminal justice center. And it seeks to bridge this gap that exists between the research that exists out there in the world, particularly in academic institutions, and on-the-ground practice of criminal law and procedure. Our goal is to make academic research and ideas accessible to those responsible for designing and implementing our criminal justice systems. And this mission, we believe, is consistent with today's webinar. And its hope is that we can help enlighten the media's coverage of criminal justice issues. Indeed, I believe there's a treasure trove of information and research which has not yet been conveyed to the public and sometimes even to criminal justice professionals. At other times, there's information that has been put forward, but without the necessary context for full understanding of the underlying issues. Providing the unvarnished facts may be the principal obligation of the press and a free society, but you also provide the necessary context and for a fully informed and thoughtful decision-making. And that has got to come at least a close second. We are, as a society, dependent on you for this. Last time, we took up one of two seismic shocks to the American society in general, which also rocked our criminal justice system, either directly or indirectly. The first tectonic movement was a virus, which emerged, as we know, in early 2020, spread as highly communicable viruses often do, crippling the American economy and shocking all of society, offering yet another challenge, perhaps the greatest challenge in recent times, to criminal justice systems that are overwhelmed, under-resourced, and of importance to us, insufficiently understood, all occurring in an already over-challenged criminal justice system throughout our nation. The consequences for jail and prison populations were lethal, of course, as COVID spread like wildfire through detention facilities. And the virus slowed and at times shuttered the courts to prevent the legal system from being a super spreader system. Today, of course, we're still living through the plague, but it's a very good time to use our COVID reality as an opportunity to take a sober second look at all aspects of criminal justice. Today, we'll continue that discussion in the panel on corrections, correctional healthcare, and the pandemic. But we also will begin with a second major jolt to the American criminal justice system, that followed the death of George Floyd, as well as the deaths of Breonna Taylor and others, which kindled a smoldering fire over racial justice in the American legal system. Today, we're going to begin with a conversation on race, law, and justice. And we are very fortunate to have with us two experts and legal leaders in the field, Nevada's Attorney General Aaron Ford, and the Utah's Commissioner on Criminal Justice and Juvenile Justice, and a former police chief, Tom Ross. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Stephen.
Okay, well, thank you. It's very well said, Erik. We really are honored to have two of the most important players in the region, and I dare say nationally, in criminal justice with us this morning. I want to start with Attorney General Ford, and what I'm going to do is give each of them about 8 or 10 minutes of time to give us a few opening remarks, and we will have a conversation briefly, and then we'll move it into question and answer session for all of you. And just to remind you, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer them as they come in. Those that aren't, we don't have time to answer, we'll bundle and send to the speakers for answering later. So let me begin with Attorney General Ford. You have his bio. Just briefly, Mr. Ford was elected Attorney General in 2018. He has a long and uh, and um, astonishing history in politics in Nevada. He's been Majority Leader of the Senate, so he can really straddle both worlds: worlds of justice, worlds of politics, and I'm sure that's what we'll be talking about to us this morning. So, Attorney General Ford, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you to those who put in on this program. I am delighted to be here. My name is Aaron Ford, and I am the Nevada Attorney General. We are here today to talk about race, law, and justice. 2020 forced us to take a long, hard look at how race is viewed in our country, and it reaffirmed that our criminal justice system still needs work. I have long advocated for and worked on criminal justice reform. However, after the death of George Floyd and the public outcry that followed, our efforts seemed to reach a new level of urgency, and this during a worldwide pandemic. As COVID-19 spread across the globe, states across the United States ordered their residents to stay home, to minimize interpersonal contact and to slow the rate of spread of the deadly virus. As the economy slowed and unemployment rose to historic levels, the mounting death toll dominated the news in the United States. It was with this backdrop of tension and uncertainty that the death of Breonna Taylor in March of 2020 and the death of George Floyd in May of 2020, we saw what felt like the first social justice breaking point in recent American history. The protests took place across the country last summer, and we were reliving that in a way now with the trial of Derek Chauvin. Additionally, we are now seeing a dramatic rise in the number of racially related incidents and hate crimes against members of the AAPI community. Just Tuesday, I hosted a panel with Connecticut's Attorney General William Tong, New York Congresswoman Grace Meng, soon to be California Attorney General Rob Bonta, a local assemblywoman and vice chair of the Judiciary Committee here in our legislature, Ms. Nguyen, and local members of the AAPI community to discuss the current situation involving a rise in racially motivated incidents and hate crimes against members of the AAPI community on a national level. I believe that having these difficult conversations will help to educate the public that hateful rhetoric leads to hateful conduct, and we all need to be allies against racial discrimination. Most of us in law enforcement are horrified, saddened, and angered by these videos of police brutality. Good law enforcement officers, which the majority of us are, do not want to be associated with those so-called few quote unquote bad apples. But the phrase "a few bad apples" to excuse law enforcement officers who engage in excessive force, unlawful policing, or who have openly violated the constitutional rights of the very individuals that they took an oath to serve and protect. Other aspects of our criminal justice system that need to be re-examined include the prison system. COVID-19 forced us to take a look at our prison populations in terms of how we allow for social distancing, hand washing, sanitizing, and healthcare access. One thing that the Nevada Department of Corrections has emphasized is the importance of making vaccines available to all inmates who want it, in the order of priority based on age and other risk factors. As of last week, approximately 1,200 corrections officers have received their first dose, with almost 800 receiving their second. And almost 800 inmates have already been vaccinated, with an average of about 50% of inmates vaccinated who have requested the vaccine. COVID-19 also forced us to take a look at the larger pretrial process, including cash bail and pretrial detention. Money bail should serve only one legitimate role: to incentivize someone to return to court as required. Bail should not be set at an amount higher than what an individual can afford, because an unreasonably high bail is no different than denying them bail at all. Even before the pandemic, however, Nevada was already examining the pretrial process. After the 2019 legislative session, a committee to conduct an interim study of issues relating to pretrial release of defendants in criminal cases was put together to reevaluate Nevada's pretrial risk assessment tool and to make recommendations on reforming our bail system. But 2020 added a new urgency. 2020 forced judges, prosecutors, sheriffs, and the community at large to think long and hard about the purpose of bail and to reevaluate who actually needs to spend their pretrial time in custody versus out on bail or some other condition of release. The safest things we as citizens were advised to do during COVID-19 include social distancing, quarantining, frequent hand washing, sanitizing, and wearing masks. However, each of these are things that can be challenging to implement in prisons and in jails. Right now, we are in the middle of our legislative session in Nevada, and I fully expect to see legislation, I think we're going to talk about some of that, seeking to make changes to the pretrial system, including cash bail, among other things. Also in this session, I personally put forth a bill that would allow my office to conduct an investigation into the pattern and practice of constitutional violations by law enforcement agencies. The US DOJ currently has that authority to conduct pattern and practice investigations of state and local enforcement agencies. That legislation was crafted in 1994 following the Rodney King incident. The officers involved were acquitted of criminal charges, but 2 were found liable on a federal civil action. But disciplining 2 officers was not enough to correct the pattern and practice of unlawful policing in Los Angeles at that time. Between 1994 and 2017, the US DOJ conducted 69 investigations into police departments, which resulted in 40 consent decrees. Unfortunately, in recent years, this tool has not been utilized by the US Attorney General. Law enforcement agencies are not being held accountable for pattern and practices of unlawful behavior and are not compelled to change. Since 2017, January of 2017, the US DOJ had not initiated a single investigation into a law enforcement agency and had not entered into a single consent decree. Then US Attorney General Mr. Sessions encouraged states to assume this kind of work rather than the federal government, and issued new guidance that limited the scope and usefulness of future consent decrees. Even if the US DOJ was to resume exercising its pattern of practice authority under the current administration, there are other reasons to pass this bill on the state level. One of the shortcomings of the federal authority is the lack of subpoena power tied to the investigatory power. If an agency declines to cooperate, the US DOJ is limited in its ability to effectively gather information. Furthermore, the Nevada Attorney General's office, in my estimation, is much more familiar with the people and agencies of our state than the federal government. And so we get to live by our mantra here, which is home means Nevada. And we have a vested interest in ensuring Nevadans are safe and their constitutional rights are protected. In addition, my office is better positioned, in my estimation, than our federal partners to understand the diversity of communities and local agencies across our state. It should also be noted that Congress is currently considering passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which extend the DOJ's pattern and practice investigative authority to the states. My understanding is that the bill has passed the House and is being considered in the Senate. But this fact does not obviate the need for state action in this area, principally because the Nevada Attorney General's office, again, is more familiar with the people and agencies of our state than is the federal government. My office also put forward a bill that would limit the scope and circumstances under which a law enforcement officer could obtain a no-knock warrant. This is incredibly important after the death of Breonna Taylor. The purpose of a no-knock warrant is to secure persons, premises, or evidence before the subject is able to respond. But from the perspective of the subject, he or she only knows that armed persons have violently entered their premises. And in those immediate moments, he or she does not know their intent, as was the case in the Breonna Taylor circumstance. An armed subject may reasonably believe that the officers serving the warrant are home invaders and respond accordingly. And the situation is rife with danger for both law enforcement and subjects. In 2017, the New York Times conducted an investigation and reported that, and I quote, at least 81 civilians and 13 law enforcement officers died in such raids from 2010 to 2016, unquote. One of the most recent examples of that tragedy was the death, of course, of Breonna Taylor in Louisville. With that said, we recognize that there may be times where an agency needs a no-knock warrant, which is why I did not seek a total ban on no-knocks. But there will be very specific facts that law enforcement will have to articulate in order to meet this high burden. And I'm happy to say that both of those bills passed the committees in their respective houses unanimously. Democrats and Republicans all voted in favor of these bills, and it was because we got at the table public defenders and police officers, district attorneys, and the ACLU, and we comprised the bill that was responsive to the requests, requirements, and needs of the community, especially in the aftermath of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. These are just a sample of legislative initiatives relating to criminal justice reform in 2021. Leaders across the state of Nevada are grappling with reforms needed in many areas of the criminal justice system. And again, I think Stephen's going to have some questions about that for me. COVID-19 was devastating in our state, but out of the wreckage arises greater resolve and a hope for better tomorrow. So I am delighted to be here to speak on the issues of race, law, and justice. Thank you so much for having me. You're muted, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Attorney General. I know at the outset I said I was going to have Mr. Ross speak and then ask you questions, but I didn't want to let some of the things you said hang without asking some questions on them because they're really fascinating. If I take what you mean, that the state is going to be a much more proactive force, whether it's in pattern of practice, and particularly with your Bill 58, that regardless of what Congress does or regardless of what the Justice Department does, you feel that the states can play a much more proactive role, both in ending police misconduct and in other areas of criminal justice. Have I got you right in that?
You absolutely are right about that, Stephen. And that's one of the main things that I indicated when I spoke out immediately in the aftermath of George Floyd. The community has called for this. There are, in my estimation, three types of communities out there. One that has the utmost trust in government. You see this on Law and Order SVU, for example, when Olivia Benson gets on the stand and she testifies and everybody in the jury nods their heads and says, yes, what she's saying is true. Right. And anyone saying something comparable, otherwise is a liar. That's one type of community that exists, utmost trust in government. There's another type that had that level of trust, but for some reason, vicariously, they've seen someone get hurt, or personally they've had an experience. That trust has diminished at some level, but they still have some level of trust. Then you have communities like mine, frankly, where I came from and grew up in, that had little to no trust in government, especially in law enforcement. I mean, to be sure, we welcome them when bad things were happening in our community, but sometimes bad things happened in our community when they showed up. And so in my estimation, my job as Attorney General is to augment trust where it already exists. It's to restore trust where it's been diminished, and it's to create it where it's never existed in the first place. And being responsive to what people were telling us over the course of this last year is one way to do all three of those things at the exact same time.
You mentioned that you had law enforcement support for Bill 58 and a few other bills, but from what I'm reading, that there's been a lot of pushback, particularly among police unions. In other parts of legislation that's in the legislature this week, such as SB 236, which calls for a new data ecosystem and really a way to monitor police who don't play by the rules and offer the chance for some sort of disciplinary conduct. And they're pushing back on that. So do you think you're going to get their support on this, or is that a fight on your hands?
Well, let me bifurcate the topics of conversation. My bills were AB or SB, I forget which house they originated in 50 and 58, and I forget the numbers. Pattern and practice and no knock warrants. That's how I remember my bills. Right. And each of those had support from law enforcement, both at the agency level and at the union level. There was one union that chimed in at the very last minute on my bill related to pattern and practice, and they opposed it. What I noted was they purposefully absent themselves from the conversation. We invited them to the table to sit with us to talk through it, as we did with other unions that participated, and the other unions agreed to the ultimate terms of those bills. And that's because we listened to them, we heard them, and we tried to find the right path to walk in that regard. So, it wasn't unanimous support from unions, but I am very happy with the amount of support that we got. Ultimately, again, that led to a unanimous vote coming out of committees. Both Democrats and Republicans alike voted unanimously to pass these bills because of the work we put in that regard. Listen, it's unfortunate that some agencies, some unions, are still pushing back on some of this. One of the things that I did right after George Floyd was to hold what I called a justice and injustice forum, where I had 6 panel discussions inviting unions, community members, ACLU, administration, and we talked about tangible solutions. And so this was no surprise to them, if you will, that I was going to run these bills. And one of the things that I've observed is a lot of people claim to be allies when it comes to addressing issues of race and justice. And that's great when the fervor is present. But when the fervor dies down, suddenly they become complacent and they back off and they forget even things that they said on camera that they were willing to do. And my suggestion is that allies remain when the fervor dies down, which is right now, for example, over in the legislative building where I need votes and I need folks to show up and testify in support of bills. Things you said you supported from an oversight perspective. And when that doesn't happen, it speaks more to them than it does to me, frankly.
Thank you. Well, let me move to the other side of the region and maybe the other side of the question to Tom Ross, who is the new executive director of the Utah Crime Commission, but also is a former law enforcement officer. He was 14 years chief of the Bountiful Utah Police Department, and has crossed the line many times, crossed the floor many times to from law enforcement now into managing criminal justice. So I think Attorney General Ford has given us a lot of fodder for discussion there, but the floor is over to you to comment and to tell us what's going on in Utah.
Thank you, Stephen, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. It's a true honor to be part of this conversation and to talk about some of the things that we're doing in Utah. As you mentioned, I come from a law enforcement background, 34 years in the same community in Bountiful, Utah, population about 45,000. And I think through those years, my experiences, my frame of reference really changed from what many would see as the typical law enforcement. I think a lot of people feel that law enforcement somewhat becomes cynical, maybe jaded. They get lied to all the time. There's all these negative things that they are put in front of, and that changes them in a negative way over time. That was not my experience, and many of those that I worked with. If anything, it actually made me see the world I lived in a very different way, oftentimes seeing myself as the person in front of me. I could have been that individual had I had a different set of circumstances. Unfortunately, had I had a different color of skin, had I had a mental health issue or a drug addiction problem, or all these things that I've seen in 34 years of dealing with people in crisis, I started connecting in a way that I felt that could be me or my loved ones. And if that's the case, what am I going to do, or how am I going to treat people to make a difference on whether they're a victim of crime or someone that's been accused of committing a crime? I found myself becoming more sympathetic and compassionate, and really struggling to find ways to connect with them, and sometimes just maybe offer a little bit of hope. I believe that's played into the progression of my career as to why I am in the role I'm in now. Part of the 14 years I was chief of police in Bountiful, 5 of the last 6 years, I've been the president of the Utah Chiefs of Police Association. And in that time and in my focus, it's been about collaborating and bringing people together, voices that were not always present with law enforcement, talking about criminal justice and the needs of communities. I felt strongly needed to be at the table. I've had this conversation many times with police chiefs, officers, sheriffs. Whatever you feel about criminal justice, there are people in your community that feel differently. And if your role is to serve your community, then your role is to understand, listen, and be responsive to the needs of everyone in your community. And that in that process has allowed me to build networks and collaborations with groups that you would not always expect law enforcement to have those. ACLU, as you heard General Ford talk about, getting the right people around the table. ACLU, Libertas, NAACP, Martin Luther King Commission. These were groups and folks that we were sitting down with in 2015 and 16 and 17. They teach at our academy for the role of the police chief course, because that is a perspective and a voice that is as critical as any voice that law enforcement brings to the table. And so my hope, and as I've come into this state level position, I know very clearly that the path that we are headed down, Justice Reinvestment Initiative, and the programs that we implemented in 2015 are the right things to do. From a concept perspective, it is absolutely the right thing to do. Treatment versus incarceration, and what can we accomplish on that piece? That's what we should be exploring. What is critically important as we do that is that we resolve and deal with the issues that come up in that process, unintended or otherwise, and try to work through those, because at the end of the day, for all of us in our communities, our people, our citizens must feel safe, respected, that the system is fair, that it has the equality built in, and that regardless of who stands in front of them in the criminal justice process, they will be treated the same and fairly. Part of one of the programs that instituted in Davis County, which is where Bountiful is located, a program that I've been very engaged in for 3.5 years, is the Davis County Receiving Center. And it's not to say that other communities or other states have not started or participated in diversion programs. I think you hear and see that everywhere. But what was different 3.5 years ago is that no one was doing it where law enforcement at that first touch, at that first conversation, was the one extending a hand saying, I want to help you. And I can do it in a way that doesn't require me charging you. That was a game changer. In a year's pilot program, we've run roughly just less than 500 people. 72%, 60 days later, are still in treatment. That's phenomenal. Many of these folks are in tears because the very person they feared the most in the moment, that officer in uniform, who they're afraid is going to arrest them, and that's going to create problems, it's going to push them down a hole deeper and that they have to climb out of, or we're going to take them to a hospital facility where they're going to incur costs, is now saying, I can take you somewhere, no charge, no cost, and start you in treatment right away. That's it. That was the change. And as folks came into that, they felt different about it because they saw it differently. And I believe it's because that person that initiates it is the one they are the most concerned with in the moment. And they are staying. Only 4 of that roughly 475 have walked away from that program, and it's voluntary. So I think that some of the things that I experienced and others in the profession that truly believe that we can evolve criminal justice and must evolve criminal justice, and we must find better ways to respond to the needs of our communities. As was mentioned, incarcerating is not resolving the problem. It hasn't resolved it for decades. But at the same time, if we're not going to put people away, we must be able to treat and help to get them on a path where they are not taking advantage of society or committing crimes. I liken it somewhat to what happened in the 60s when we did away with asylums for mental health. I mean, everyone is saying, what has happened with the mental health problem? I can tell you as a law enforcement officer over 34 years, it changed decade by decade by decade to the number of calls that we were responding on. And everyone's saying the police need to do it better. And they're not wrong. But it's much bigger than that. When we shut down asylums, we didn't have a backup plan. We just let people be in the communities and we hoped that outpatient treatment would resolve it. But as those numbers grew and the crimes grew, it put us in the spot that we are in now. So programs like a receiving center concept program that we can get people into treatment, hook them up with a peer, be able to have medical assisted treatment, therapists, counselors, medical provided assistance, those things are critical. And that's a program that in Utah is expanding. It started in 2019. We're now expanding to 3 other counties. In the process of Utah County just opened theirs. And the hope is that we can roll a program like this statewide and offer other opportunities. In fact, as we talked about COVID and the impacts that COVID has had on criminal justice this past year, this was a bright light because we couldn't take individuals into jails unless they committed crimes of violence. We didn't want to be putting people together. But a lot of these folks wouldn't have gone to jail anyway with the receiving center program, and they're going to treatment. That is public safety because they're removed from the street. and they immediately are engaged in treatment in a way that might have taken weeks, months, or years, if even at all, through the court system and the criminal justice process. So I think in Utah, what we are definitely focused on, we felt like our session that we just came out of, we had positive movement on issues that need to be addressed. We're not solving all of these challenges, I get that, but we had collaboration, involvement from multiple groups, civic groups, and they helped in drafting and being able to move forward this legislation. The Department of Public Safety and CCJJ, which is the acronym for the organization I sit at, even though I wasn't in the role when this started, they've been holding outreach meetings monthly with communities of color, with religious leaders of color, legislators of color, youth, and law enforcement, and all these groups that need to be talking. And the Chiefs of Police Association with the League of Cities and Towns started the Love, Listen, Lead program. The very same thing, multiple meetings over the course of months, bringing people together that don't always sit in front of each other and talking about everything from law enforcement discipline to law enforcement use of force to school resource officers to incarceration, all of these things we're talking. And that is what I believe is really going to be the answer to resolving these conflicts, is putting people face to face around tables in rooms that don't see eye to eye, and yet work through what they want criminal justice to look like in their communities. Bail reform that you heard General Ford talk about, Utah passed a pretrial release bail reform bill in 2019, and there were challenges that came from that. I believe strongly that most of those challenges could be blamed on COVID and changes that we made in our system to address COVID, but law enforcement didn't know that. So when we came out with penny warrants, a 1 cent bond, which judges were using to get people to appear, even though we weren't holding trials, but we still had a court process. In their world, it made perfect sense to have a 1 cent warrant. It doesn't there's no punitive punishment, but if you haven't been attending, then this will get your attention. Well, put yourself in a law enforcement officer's shoes. I'm now potentially going to arrest somebody on a 1 cent bond. And if I use force, or we get in a fight, or worse, deadly force, how can anybody wrap their minds around the need for that?
So let me,
without talking to each other, the judges thought they were doing the right things. I can appreciate that. Law enforcement thought our version was better. We need to be present and talking.
so we have a lot of questions. I don't want to cut you off there. We have a lot of questions coming in. The Attorney General Ford has given us a really ambitious agenda, extraordinary agenda for what he sees happening in Nevada. And there's a lot of rich stuff that you've been talking about, Tom, that deserves questions on its own. But I just want to ask you just briefly, would you support this, would Utah support the same direction that Nevada seems to be going in terms of creating a different kind of structure for looking at how police operate, whether it's disciplining police when they do wrong, keeping track of what they do? Just briefly, is Utah in the same ballpark, or are you in different ways? I think we lost him.
Look like we lost him.
My gosh.
Oh man.
Oh, it wasn't that hard of a question.
Yeah, you ran him off, man. Like, don't run me off. You
All
might.
right, well, let's hope he gets back. Chris, can you find out? Let me start with some questions in the meantime. I don't know what happened to him, but we have questions for you, Attorney General Ford, that I wanted to bring up. So there's a question from Felicia Fonseca of the Associated Press, who wants to know whether you support the bill currently in the legislature of Nevada to abolish the death penalty, and why do you think similar bills haven't passed before this in Nevada?
Well, I'll take the second question first as to why similar bills haven't passed. I used to be in the state Senate. I was a majority leader in the state Senate, and I was minority leader at one point as well. And I did see some of those bills percolate through And at the end of the day, they fell for lack of utter support from legislators, oftentimes listening to their constituents. So that's why I think in the past they haven't passed. That's not to say this time it won't happen. But to answer your first question, I have been clear on the record since before I ran for office the very first time. I remember interviewing with a particular association, and they asked me specifically if I supported the death penalty, and I said no, I do not, because of the racial inequities associated with it and other things. And I didn't get that endorsement. But I have stuck by my beliefs in that regard. I still believe that the death penalty should be abolished. But I am the top law enforcement officer in the state, and will absolutely enforce the laws as they exist. And in fact, there may be an execution this year, which would require me to sit in the there and watch the death chamber operation. And I will do that as part of my duty. So that bill aligns with my personal belief, but I have not put my thumb on the scale one way or the other relative to weighing in on that bill. But it's no secret to anybody out there where Aaron Ford stands on the death penalty.
Okay, thank you. I've got two questions from Nikki Roberts. First question is on with the rise in hate crimes around the country. She's asking whether there are actionable items from your office that can act to prevent such hateful conduct in Nevada and beyond.
Yeah, listen, I think we had a very robust discussion on Tuesday with my roundtable with some national leaders. And listen, if you haven't talked to William Tong in Connecticut about this issue, you need to listen to him. I get goosebumps, chills. He was fervently speaking on these issues, and I think he has some very good thoughts. And out of that conversation arose things that I can do I don't have jurisdictional authority over certain crimes that predominantly go to the district attorneys, and we don't have a specific hate crime law, except we have enhancements for hate crimes. And so what I have suggested folks do is to always, first off, you have to file a complaint. And I know the burden is tough to have to file a complaint over something that could be as demeaning as a hate crime, but law enforcement cannot respond to complaints they don't know about. And so so one tangible thing we suggested is that file a complaint. We've secondly said that you should also, if it's not necessarily a hate crime from a violent perspective where law enforcement should get involved, but let's say you're being discriminated against in housing or on your employment or in a public accommodation, file with our Equal Rights Commission. And let that be known. Be proactive and at the same time being reactive when you see these types of experiences take place. And then finally, we would say to continue to educate. One of the things I said on Tuesday was that education has always been used to indoctrinate. And oftentimes the indoctrination doesn't weigh in favor of equality and understanding. The first time I learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example, the very first time I even heard about it was in law school. And that was to learn about the proposition that Congress had the plenary authority to do whatever they wanted to in immigration, including kicking people out, even if it was racist. So, I didn't learn about that in my history books in Dallas, Texas. I saw pictures of myself in a slave, section, but never anything about the Chinese Exclusion Act. So, educate folks and to recognize that they have been miseducated oftentimes on true history in our country.
So I want to move quickly to a question from Chandra Whitfield, which really is for both gentlemen. I see Tom is back, but she's asking, how would you say the George Floyd and the Breonna Taylor cases have affected policing and criminal justice practices in both of your states, Nevada and Utah? Maybe, Tom, I'll let you take that first and then move it over to Attorney General Ford.
Yes, thank you. Sorry if that was, I don't know what happened, but
You got worried. We thought that
to get back in. That's the virtual world we're in.
it is.
Well, it has had profound impact on what we're doing with criminal justice in the state. It's not the first time that we've been having conversations about race relationships and law enforcement and community relationships. We saw that start really back in 2014. In most of the years that I was in the presidency of the Chiefs, I had conversations about race relationships and equity, fairness, diversity, probably well over 100 times in those 5 years. And it made it very clear and aware that we had a long ways to go. But I think what happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, as mentioned by General Ford, is it kind of set a shock through the system. I think what we deal with all the time in criminal justice and certainly in law enforcement is people have their perceptions of what's happening. Some are positive, some might be negative, some might be based and founded on a singular incident or something they see. I haven't talked to a single person that saw what happened to George Floyd, whether it's on a law enforcement side or otherwise civilian side, that wasn't heartbroken and just torn apart by what they saw. That has brought the change forward, I believe, in rising up these issues that many have been speaking about for years and decades. And it brought it to a level that everyone understood, at least at that moment and in that time, this can't be how we serve justice in our communities. So it made those conversations difficult at times. That's important in order for us to work through it. But I think, like I mentioned earlier, we're sitting around the table from the people we need to be listening to and talking with, and they need to be talking to us and hearing from us. And I believe that is moving things forward in a positive way.
Thank you. Attorney General Ford, how has it changed the landscape in Nevada?
Yeah, directly. It's directly changed it. Last summer, we had a special session that dealt with criminal justice issues. And out of that came a ban of chokeholds, i.e., what we saw happen to George Floyd. I mean, it was a knee on the neck, but in this instance, we talked about they banned chokeholds in our state. We also implemented a duty to intervene, put it in law. It was in policy in certain police departments, but it was not in law. And we all know that as administrations change, so do policies. So we've made it a state policy, a state law, that officers have a duty to intervene when they see someone else's constitutional rights being violated. And that's a quick summary fashion of that. My no-knock warrant bill, that's a direct result of Breonna Taylor's killing, and recognizing that we need to address that. The pattern and practice bill arose out of the George Floyd circumstance. And so, listen, what was important, and I want to give Tom some credit, right? He's talked about getting folks in the room who typically are ignored in the conversation, whether it's on purpose or on accident. They have not been heard at the table. And what the approach I've taken, both as a senator and as Attorney General, is to get everybody in the room, district attorneys and public defenders. I want them talking about this at the same time in front of everybody so we can hear what's reasonable and what's unreasonable, and so that we can find out where the compromises and opportunities are. We had the police unions and we had brass, for lack of a better phrase, in the room, right? We had the ACLU in there. We had all kinds of folks in this room to try to get these bills that were unanimously passed out of their respective chambers, committees in their respective houses. We still got to get them passed through the rest of the process. But the reason why I mention this is because criticism is appropriate if it's constructive criticism. And what's important for law enforcement to know oftentimes is when they are hearing from community members that they are attempting to offer constructive criticism. And we shouldn't always review or receive what's being suggested to us as destructive criticism or unwarranted criticism. Let's absolutely sit down and have a conversation, and we may agree to disagree, but it is an unfair process to disagree without even having had a conversation. So those are some of the impacts that George Floyd and Breonna Taylor had directly in our state. You're muted. You're muted, Stephen. Can't hear you, buddy.
Sorry. Thank you very much. So we're just about out of time, but I didn't want to close the session without addressing one very important question that Felicia Fonseca brought up, and one that I was going to bring up as well myself, which is, and really this goes from both states. She asks Tom Ross in particular whether the legislature has done enough to ensure that people experiencing mental health crises won't be harmed by law enforcement. She points out the story of a Salt Lake City autistic boy, a 13-year-old, who was shot after his mother called for help with mental health treatment. We see those stories all over the country. It's not just in the Southwest. And I know that in Nevada as well, it's a major issue about the role that police should play in dealing with people who have mental issues. I wonder if you both can answer very briefly how you see things evolving in dealing with people who become justice involved and who have mental health issues. So maybe just 2 minutes each, and you could sum up from the other points here as well. Thank you. Tom, you first, if you could.
No, to the question, we have not done enough, and we haven't done near enough. And part of the problem is that it's expensive to do what we need to do to fairly and appropriately and responsibly treat mental health. It's going to cost money, and that's probably the bigger reason why it's lagged. I don't think anyone argues that this is a problem and that we need to do better, but it impacts so many in the country that I think that just the sheer dollar scares everybody. Now, so the question is there going to be any incident where law enforcement in Utah is perceived as done the wrong thing or does the wrong thing with mental health going forward? I can't say that won't happen. What we did have come out of this training, this session, is increased amounts of required hours of training for de-escalation, mental health, autism training specifically with law enforcement, in hopes that we're getting our law enforcement officers to recognize that you may have to talk more. You may need to spend more time in resolving this instead of going to giving demands. And I think we're seeing that play out. I mean, keep in mind that as you look at the incidents that are occurring with law enforcement that are negative, the amount of mental health calls that law enforcement responds on daily is increasing. Year by year, it's increased. So I think that they are trying to do the right things in a world that sometimes is very difficult to get everybody on the same page. And I hope the receiving center programs, I think that is definitely the right step to be going down now and in the path, because the one thing that's huge in this is law enforcement, for most of dealing with mental health and substance use, they couldn't be in a place to win. No one wanted them. The families didn't want it because they were afraid. The public didn't feel we're doing enough to keep their community safe if someone with substance use problems burglarizing their homes lives up the street. This gives law enforcement an opportunity to actually be the good guys and gals, extend the hand. I think that will be a big change.
Thank you. Attorney General Ford, you have the last word.
Yeah. So listen, the problem's dynamic, and it's going to take a dynamic solution. We live in a silver state, I like to say, in Nevada, but there's no silver bullet when it comes to answering a lot of these questions. And the issues of mental health as intersect with the criminal justice system are readily apparent when you have instances that you've talked about in Utah and Nevada. And what we're trying to do here is to address these in as many varying ways as we can. The mobile outreach support teams, for example, in our Reno area is one such example, where mental health experts accompany oftentimes law enforcement to calls where they know a mental health issue may be present. But here's the issue. Tom said it. It's money. It's personnel. I think I saw in the chat someone from the Review Journal here in Vegas talked about social workers working with our local police departments. Those are all great ideas, but it takes time, it takes money, it takes expertise, and time waits for no one when it comes to these exigent circumstances that we find ourselves in. And the last thing I'll say on this issue is this: we put a lot on our police officers' responsibilities. They have to be mental health experts when they don't have a most team person standing there, so recognizing that, and people, we as citizenry, as residents, we don't call 311 when we see someone who we think we maybe having a mental health episode. We call 911, and 911 is the police number, right? And so police are going to show up. There's going to have to be a mass re-education of sorts relative to how to figure this out. But then the question becomes, do you really want a civilian trying to determine whether we are experiencing an actual criminal or a mental health issue, and then making a decision to call 311 versus 911, right? So there's going to have to be a lot of dynamic education going on with the ways that we address this. Nevada is poised to continue working on that. I've personally, my office has personally funded some of the most programs when I was in the state Senate. We did that as well. So we look forward to continuing working with law enforcement and others in this area to try to effect better change.
Thank you. So this is an excellent segue into our next session, which we're going to be talking again about balancing policing and public safety. On one of our panels is Andre Anderson, former from Arizona, but he's chief of the Rochester, New York Police Department, where that issue like that came very much to the fore in headlines. So we will keep this conversation going. We have a lot of questions still in the bank that have been unasked, but we'll bundle them up and send them to both of you for answering at your leisure. But I want to thank both of you for your time and your honest and candid answers. And I invite you to stay with us to watch the rest of the morning. But thank you very much, and we will take a 10-minute break right now. Thank you
Thank
all.
you so much.
Thank you.